Rowan has closed the door. It's the official signal that we can begin. Well, my name's Chris Deeran, I'm Director of Reform Scotland, and genuinely delighted to invite to see all of you here tonight. I think the turnout, which is not nothing, tells us something about where we are in Scottish politics, where the Scottish Labour Party is, the level of interest in what it's about and what it has to say for itself. It's been fascinating as a journalist as well as a think tanker to watch how Scottish politics has really been turned on its head since roughly Nicola Sturgeon resigned in February. The tectonic plates, which have been so stable for so long, have at last started to move after years of largely untroubled nationalist dominance. And I think whatever your view of politics or party preference or whatever, the idea of a more competitive politics is to be welcomed. You know, no one should run a country untroubled by challenge for as long as
we speak up a little bit.
Oh yes, of course I can. Sorry, I can be very loud if you like. Yeah, I've got a bullhorn, which we would do it. Keir Starmer is heading for Downing Street. I don't think there's any point pretending that that's not going to happen. And Scottish Labour is neck and neck in the polls with the SNP. Increasingly, we see that that's just here to stay. And they've been inflicting some punishing by-election defeats on Humza Yousaf, who is a new First Minister who doesn't have his problems to seek, both self-inflicted and delivered by his predecessor. I think it's fair to say that all is to play for. It no longer even feels particularly unthinkable that in 2026 Anas Sarwar could be First Minister, and we wouldn't have said that certainly a year ago, maybe even 6 months ago. In which case, he and his party deserve our close scrutiny. After decades as the dominant party in Scottish politics, Scottish Labour, you know, I remember standing outside Scottish Labour executive meetings at the Stirling Council headquarters where they would be basically deciding the fate of the country through local government, and then they'd go out and phone you from the toilets to bitch about each other as they did it. And there was a definite complacency, this is our nation, we decide it. And then they got booted in 2007, and we've had 16 years of nationalist government, 16 years of pretty punishing and repeated election defeats for Labour, sometimes quite humiliating as it's gone on. So as we move to maybe a new argument, a new reality about what Scottish politics is, I think it's probably a good time to ask Scottish Labour about who they are, what they are in 2023 that they weren't in 2007 or in 1999 or even before that, and what do they stand for, who are its key individuals, in government especially. I think this is important tonight. What would it do differently to the SNP? And tonight is really intended to give us a chance to hear more from senior figures in the party about that, and to almost look them in the whites of their eyes and say, right, come on, prove it to us that you are ready to govern. I think one of my concerns has been that after the SNP's long spell in power, is that Labour would feel it necessary to operate somewhere within the parameters that Nicola Sturgeon set for what was acceptable and what wasn't in policy terms, that they'd have to try and keep together a winning coalition, which will inevitably involve some soft yes voters, as well as no voters, unionists, probably some Tory voters, some Lib Dem voters. You know, you're going to end up with this big coalition if there is a change that will represent a vote for a change in government to Labour. And keeping that together is a difficult thing, especially if you're going to try and do some of the things that I suspect most of us here know need to be done to put the country onto a more interesting and progressive future. It'll take some courage to break those parameters that Nicola Sturgeon set apart, so hopefully we'll hear a bit about that tonight. I think this means a genuinely ambitious and reform-minded approach on the areas that maybe the SNP didn't focus on. So in my view, those would include the key areas of wealth creation, economic growth, the reform of public services such as education and the NHS. I do feel that the lack of attention to these, coupled with the real obsession with the Constitution, has amounted to a sort of neglect and has allowed problems to store up, not just for the long term, but as we increasingly see for the present. So if Labour wins, we're going to need a different type of government, one with a willingness to use its political capital to push through the changes that are necessary, but that may not always be popular with powerful vested interests, which have had, I think, too big a say in the way the nation's run for too long. We're going to need to reform an NHS that is in perma-crisis and that is in real danger of falling over. If you speak to medics and people that know what they're talking about, they are genuinely worried that it will survive the decade in its current form. We need to reform schools that are failing children, often the very children that need them most, whose life chances depend on a good education, getting them out of difficult backgrounds. And we need a willingness to support and celebrate business and entrepreneurs and innovators so that Scotland has more and better jobs, that it thrives in those new industries so vital to the future, that the tax base grows, not just for the sake of making some people wealthier, but actually to raise the taxes that will allow us to fund strong and hopefully reformed public services. I certainly don't believe that constantly increasing taxes on the middle classes is, regardless of the awful cost of living crisis where the poor have been hit hardest, I don't think you can keep increasing taxes to the point that the middle classes are really struggling more than they can cope with. That's not desirable or sustainable. Anyway, that's my 2 shillings worth. It's what we're working towards on a daily basis at Reform Scotland, and will continue to work towards over the next 3 years, as we have a general election probably next year, maybe at the start of the year after, and a Holyrood election in 2026. But this evening is about hearing from those who are asking for the keys to government, and asking them to start filling in some of the blanks around why they want those keys and what they'll do with them if we decide to give them, to hand them over. We were initially due to have Michael Mara, the Shadow Cabinet Secretary for Finance, as our keynote speaker tonight. Unfortunately, due to personal circumstances, Michael can't make it. But however, we have the equally charismatic and interesting and powerful Daniel Johnson, Shadow Cabinet Secretary for the Economy, Business and Fair Work. And Daniel's going to begin proceedings with a speech setting out his thinking around the economic future of Scotland. We'll then move to a panel discussion involving Daniel and his colleagues Polly McNeill, the Shadow Cabinet Secretary for Justice, and Paul O'Kane, who's Shadow Cabinet Secretary for Social Justice and Social Security and Equalities. We'll make sure there's plenty of time for questions. I really hope you will ask questions. The more difficult, the better. I'm not going to sit here and just go on at them and ask them my questions. I want to hear from you tonight. This is the point of the event tonight. So thank you again for attending. I hope it's going to prove worth your while. And I'll now hand over to Daniel Johnson.
Thank you very much, Chris. And I hope you and everyone realises that this evening brings with it a high degree of jeopardy for my political ego, because not only have I had to accept that I'm Michael Mara's understudy, I also knew that a lot of tickets had been sold for this evening, so that when it was announced that it wasn't Michael speaking, it would be me, I kind of worried that the room might be half empty. So I'm very pleased that you still wanted to come along this evening. And look, I think Chris sets out some really important points of reference for what not only we're here to talk to you about this evening, but also where Scottish Labour finds itself. And what Michael had wanted to do was set out his role in terms of leading the policy review, and also in terms of some of our thinking and approach to fiscal issues, because they are so central. But the fundamental point is this, is that we do find ourselves in a position I think many of us didn't necessarily expect to find. We hoped we would find ourselves in this position, but it brings with it, I think, a certain sense of responsibility. And in fact, somebody was asking me at the beginning, well, we've been through an awful lot. It's been certainly, having been elected in 2016, it's been something of a roller coaster ride. So how does it feel to have a vote share in the UK voting intention in Scotland of 38%, to be levelling with the SNP? And it is, that overarching sense I have is one of responsibility, because I think there is a sense of expectation. I think there is a sense that we have to fill in those gaps that Chris set out, to explain what we would do differently, because I don't think it can be business as usual. Things have to change, and central to that is the economy, which is why Michael's not saying his thing this evening. What I'm very happy to do is set out some of our economic thinking, more critically how we're approaching devising an economic plan and what we hope to do with that. But let me start with this, that we have to recognise how centrally important the economy is. We've had 20 years of devolution, and to date the Scottish Parliament has very much been a focus of social policy. It's been somewhere where we have looked at social issues, and that's been very often to the detriment of economic issues. But I think we have to correct that. And we have to correct that for two important reasons. Firstly, and perhaps kind of most importantly, the fiscal framework and fiscal devolution that happened following 2016 means that the only way we get more money to spend on social policies is by growing the economy. The fiscal framework is complicated, but boils down to a very simple principle, that Scotland needs to grow its per capita income tax receipts at a greater rate than the UK in order to receive more money. If it grows more slowly, we receive less. It is really that simple. But I think more fundamentally, there's an insight which is this, is that you can only have successful social policy if you have a successful economy through which it can be funded. That you can only have successful public institutions if you have a thriving private sector to generate the tax receipts that are required to do it. And that is fundamentally why someone like me, coming from a business background, I'm in the Labour Party. And because of actually a very profound perspective, which is this, is that I am in the Labour Party because I believe that Labour is the party of work. We are the party that believes in fairness at work, but most critically also opportunity through work. And that's what brings someone like me, who absolutely is a believer in the opportunities that businesses create, that the security that it creates for people and their families. But what brings someone from that business background into the Labour Party is that centrality of work, the importance of work, and the opportunities that provides. But the reality is that Scotland doesn't have an economy that's generating those things. In many ways, it's flatlining. We are used to the narrative of the Scottish economy outperforming the UK, having better productivity growth. And that was true through the 80s and 90s, but has ceased to be the case over the last decade. The reality is, on the most recent economic data, is that in terms of jobs growth, we are second from bottom in terms of comparison with other UK regions, well below the UK average. Likewise, on earnings growth, we are below the UK average and lagging behind regions such as the Southwest, and we were slower to recover on both of those measures than every other UK nation and well below the UK average. Quite simply, we are seeing Scotland being outperformed by places like Manchester and the Northwest, regions which have fewer powers, less available to them in terms of shaping their economies around them than Scotland had. So we have to ask ourselves the question, why? And quite simply, I think it's because of a lack of strategy. We've done a very good job in recent years of selling Scotland to the Scots, but our task is to sell Scotland to the world. And in a sense, I think it's straightforward. If you look at what Scotland's assets and capacities and capabilities are, we have extraordinary opportunities in front of us. In that region of the country, between the cities of Edinburgh, Glasgow and Dundee, we have 80% of the population. You can do everything from build satellites to make concrete. We have higher education institutions which are world leaders, from life sciences to artificial intelligence through to advanced engineering. And that density of manufacturing and knowledge sits right next door to huge expanses of country, and next to one of the world's greatest renewables potential in terms of our offshore wind generating capacity. So we have these three core assets sitting in close proximity, which provide us with an opportunity in Scotland, which is really unrivaled, and a degree of latitude, which is of a huge advantage as we face climate change. So in a sense, it's simple. It's about joining those dots, looking at where those assets are, and looking at what we need to do to ensure that they can be brought together, how those links can be made, and very often physical links. It is about infrastructure, about roads, railways, and buses. And yet, we have a Scottish Government that makes this complicated. We have a Scottish Government that's very good at generating strategies, but poor at implementing a strategy. We have an acknowledgement for years that we have a cluttered landscape of agencies, and yet we continue to create yet more. So it's against that backdrop that Anas Sarwar has set out our three key economic focuses, and that we've invited a board of independent business people and thinkers to help us shape a plan that will deliver against those three focuses. And I know actually there's lots of people in the room that have heard us go through these, and but I will go through them again. But I'd also like to set out the next steps about actually how we will seek to realise those. But those three key focuses are as follows. First of all is net zero. As I've said, we have a huge opportunity, a massive possibility for generating carbon neutral energy with our offshore potential. And we have to ensure that we do that not just to realise that potential, but to also recognising the fact that we have to transition people from the traditional offshore oil and gas sectors, a sector that employs the best part of 100,000 people on wages of well above the median wage. If we fail to do that, we will put our economy at a huge economic disadvantage. The second focus is around financial services and technology. Again, a sector employing over 140,000 people across the country, making a GVA contribution of around 15%, but also a technology one that is looking at the future, which is why financial services and technology belong together, because it is in combination that we can provide many of the jobs of the future, but through our financial services expertise, but through the application of technology. And finally, brand Scotland, because Scotland has extraordinary soft power. We have an advantage both in terms of our land, people's understanding, the products we produce that are world renowned, the envy of many other countries that struggle to that, but we don't necessarily, I think, realise the full potential of that. So we have to have a clear strategy to sell Scotland to the rest of the world, sell our products, and also sell our distinctiveness in terms of our broader economy, having that clarity, that sense of brand that we express to the rest of the world. But we also need to understand how this fits together in terms of a broader economic strategy. And then coupled with these three focuses, what is emerging from the conversations we're having with the board and the other conversations we're having with stakeholders and industry groups across the economy, I think are three core principles, which are firstly partnership, planning and pipeline, and finally the convening power of government. So in terms of partnership, I think what is very clear is that business and industry has a real need for government to go further than simply consultation. I think they need government to be a genuine partner in their activity, to understand their needs, to ensure that business and industry is in the room when core decisions are being made, not simply informed once they have been, having had the engagement in advance. That is what leading economies do. You know, from the economies in Asia through to the Nordic countries and Germany, having clear partnership between the state, between government and industry is absolutely vital. But it also needs to be partner at the point of delivery. So I think one of the key questions here is what that partnership looks like at a national level, but also critically a regional level, because it is very clear when you look at the international evidence and best practice, is at that point of delivery, at that regional level, that's how you generate economic growth. But what Scotland lacks is, despite all the advantages I set out, is that ability to actually deliver policy, economic policy and infrastructure at that regional level. We have a sporadic array of different bodies and structures, none of which come together. And again, if we look at the regions of the UK which are doing better, we have to ask ourselves, what is it that the metro regions have, the metro mayors have, that Scotland does not? And I think one of the one things I would say as a note of caution is I think the structure of mayors are very interesting, but I think it's the structure and the function rather than the office itself that we need to focus on. And actually, it's something I really commend, I think, Reform Scotland for trying to explore and examine this. But when you talk to people in Manchester, what is very clear is that the combined authority, that ability to draw together strands of government, the ability to draw together strands of funding along with business, that is the secret sauce. That is what brings together the investment. It's about making it simple for capital to invest, having clarity and that common purpose across those different facets of government and in business to provide clear investable opportunities is absolutely central. So partnership, I think, is one of the first principles. The second is planning. And what has struck me in recent months is that I've gone from a position as a Labour Party politician where I have talked to business people and said, I'd really like to talk to you about industrial strategy, and there's been a bit of an eye roll, to a point where sectoral bodies and businesses are saying, we would like to talk to you about industrial strategy, because I think it is very clear, given the challenges we face, the extraordinary change that we have to deal with, whether it's demographics, technology change or climate change, that we need a plan. And we need a plan not just where we understand what business needs to do and for government to understand that, but government understands its role as well. So that we have a pipeline of action and coordination between industry and government. And that critically, that government aligns its policies and its practices in order to feed in to that pipeline and to that plan. I mean, what has really struck me since I've been doing this job is that how frequently conversations with business quickly turn to talking about planning and consenting. And what that says to me is that we have a regime that is simply not aligned to our economic plans, and we need to ask ourselves why. So what we need is genuine, a genuine industrial plan, pipeline, and one which both industry and government understands its role and what part it has to play. And then finally is the convening power of the state. And then I think one of the best examples of this is a situation I found myself in 18 months ago, discussing ScotWind with one of the successful bidders and standing next to somebody from one of the shipbuilding operations in Scotland. And the person from the energy company was saying, well, we will need to think about building ships. Well, just so happens the person standing next to me is somebody that knows how to build ships. And then the person from the shipbuilding company said, well, this is all well and good, but you can't just build 1 or 2 ships. You need to build at least 12, because it's only at that scale that can be achieved. And what struck me as odd that I, as an opposition politician, was the person making the introduction between those 2 people. But secondly, that what we needed was the state to bring those parties together, recognizing where there was a need for business to act together, collaboratively, in order to achieve that broader outcome. Now that is finally happening, but it is being too slow. And there are other examples, such as in skills, where we need more action on a sectoral basis, rather than individual companies acting separately. Because I think we're well used to the concept of first mover advantage of business, but there can also be a first mover cost. And what we need business to do is use its convening power to enable business to work together where there's shared interest and to achieve those wider collective goals. So I've set out the three key focuses, and I think the 3 key principles which I think will help shape policy that brings those to life. But I would also just like to end on this, because I think we recognise, as we look at the possibility of power, that it will not be easy. If we win power at the next general election at a UK level, if we were to win power into 2026, we would be inheriting one of the most challenging set of economic circumstances that any incoming government would have done since the war. To say that there would be fiscal restraint, I think, is an understatement. So if we are going to achieve these things, we will have to do things differently. And I think there are 2 key things that I would point to. First of all, we will have to have an absolutely overarching focus on delivery. And one of our bits of required reading has been Michael Barber's book of How to Run a Government. And Michael Barber was the person who was in charge of the delivery unit in 10 Downing Street when we were last in government. And that sense of having a prioritisation, overarching measures and prioritisation, so you can deliver against those key strategic outcomes that you wish to, is going to be absolutely vital. And we will have to look at bringing that delivery focus if we were to come to government, both at a UK level, but I think particularly at a Scottish level. And the other thing, in terms of doing things differently, is I come from a retail background. And I think we often talk about how industry and the economy is going to be disrupted by technology. The retail industry has already been through that. The retail industry has experienced huge technology disruption. And I think that's what is clear across anyone in business, is if you don't realise that your business is going to have to become a technology business, you should be preparing for your business to cease to exist. Now, what I would say is that technology disruption, I think, applies to all areas of life and all areas of activity, and that includes the public sector, it includes government. So if we are going to seek to do things differently, we're going to have that overarching delivery focus, but we'll also have to embrace technology change, because I think there's huge potential, both in terms of how we do policy development and design public services using technology, learning the lessons of places like Finland and Estonia to do things differently, to ensure that things are much more focused, targeted and person-centric, and using and capturing technology. And I'll just close with this thought. I think we do stand at a very interesting moment in time, certainly as a Labour Party. And in 1994, on the eve of his death, John Smith made the very famous quote that we all know, that to serve, that is all, the opportunity to serve, that is all we seek. And I think that ethos of service is incredibly important as you seek government. But I think actually our challenge is a little bit different. I think it's the opportunity to deliver. That is what we seek, because that will have to be our overarching focus and obsession, because it is going to be challenging, it is going to be tough, and we are going to have to do things differently. Hopefully that is a good context for the discussion.